Della Brandt was 10 years old the spring she buried her mother and planted a corner of the family's worst ground with sunflower seeds from a rusted tin. The note tucked inside was in her mother's hand. Plant them where the corn won't grow. Her father couldn't stand the sight of them. The neighbors laughed. The kids at school called her the sunflower girl, like it was something to be ashamed of. In a county where corn was king, a grieving child had wasted good dirt on yellow. Then the rain stopped. For 91 days, not a drop fell, and the corn curled brown to the horizon. But on 5 sandy acres nobody wanted, her mother's sunflowers were still standing. And the reason why was something her mother had carried all the way from another state and never lived to explain. But that comes later. To understand the field, you have to understand the quiet that came before it. The casserole dishes were the worst part. For 2 weeks after the funeral, the women from town kept bringing them. Glass pans of scalloped potatoes and hot dish and chicken and cream of mushroom soup, all wrapped in foil with a strip of masking tape on top so you'd know whose dish to return. They stacked up in the refrigerator until Ray Brandt couldn't close the door. And then they stacked up on the counter, and Della watched them go cold and gray and finally into the trash because nobody in that house had any appetite left. Her mother had been gone 6 weeks. The ground was still half frozen. Ray didn't talk much anymore. He had always been a quiet man, the kind who said what needed saying and then let the silence do the rest. But this was a different silence. He'd come in from the barn, hang his cap on the nail, and sit at the kitchen table looking at the chair where his wife used to sit. Some nights, he didn't even turn the light on. Della would find him there in the dark, and she'd flick the switch, and he'd blink at her like he'd forgotten she lived there too. "You eat?" he'd ask. "Yeah," she'd say, even when she hadn't. "Good. School tomorrow." That was most of it. That was a whole conversation between them some days. The dog helped. Barley was an old yellow farm dog, gone gray around the muzzle, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped. He had slept beside Marlene's side of the bed for years, and after the funeral he started sleeping outside Della's door instead, like somebody had to. When Della cried at night, and she cried most nights, Barley would push the door open with his nose and lay his heavy head on the edge of her mattress and breathe at her until she slept. It was Barley who found the coat. Della's mother's barn coat still hung on the hook by the back door, a faded canvas thing the color of weak coffee, too big for a 10-year-old by a mile. Ray hadn't moved it. Della suspected he couldn't. One cold morning while she waited for the bus, she pulled it down and put it on, just to have something of her mother around her shoulders, and she rolled the sleeves 3 times so her hands would show. Barley sniffed at the pocket and wouldn't quit. Della reached in. Her fingers closed around something cold and round. It was a tin. An old candy tin, the paint worn down to bare metal at the corners, with a lid that took 2 hands and a grunt to pry off. Inside were seeds. Hundreds of them, fat and gray and striped. The sort you'd see spit out at a ball game, except these weren't roasted and salted. These were whole, alive maybe, and folded on top was a slip of paper, soft from handling, with 6 words written in her mother's slanted hand. "Plant them where the corn won't grow." Della read it 4 times, standing there in the cold kitchen. The bus came and went. She didn't go to school that day, and nobody noticed, because nobody was checking. She knew exactly which ground her mother meant. Down past the barn, where the land sloped toward the creek, there were 5 acres of sand. Every farmer in the county had ground like it somewhere, a low spot or a sandy patch that wouldn't hold water or wouldn't hold corn or wouldn't hold anything but disappointment. Ray called the South 5 a lot of things over the years, and most of them weren't words you said in church. He'd plant it to corn every spring, out of stubbornness and habit, and every August it would stand there yellow and stunted, while the rest of the field went tall and green, and every fall it would barely make enough to cover the seed he put in it. Her mother used to stand at the kitchen window and look down at that sandy corner and say, "Ray, that ground is trying to tell you something." And Ray would say, "It's telling me it's lazy." And her mother would smile and not argue, because she was not a woman who argued. She was a woman who waited. One evening, the summer before she got sick, her mother had walked Della down to that corner and crouched and pushed her fingers into the sand and let it pour out between them. "Feel that," she'd said. "Everybody else's dirt holds together. This won't. Your daddy thinks that makes it worthless." She had smiled at the creek. "But there's things that love ground like this. Things with roots that go straight down instead of spreading out. We just haven't planted the right thing yet." Della had been 9 and hadn't understood, and her mother hadn't explained, and then came the winter, and there wasn't any more time for explaining. Now Della understood she had been waiting for this. She didn't tell her father. She knew what he'd say, and she didn't think she could stand to hear him say it about her mother's seeds. So she waited too. She waited until the morning Ray drove into town to see the man at the bank. His jaw set tight and Marlene's reading glasses tucked in his shirt pocket, where he thought nobody could see them. And the second his truck disappeared down the county road, Della went and got her mother's hoe. The hoe was almost as tall as she was. The handle was worn smooth and dark where her mother's hands had gripped it for years. Della carried it down to the South 5 with a tin of seeds in the big front pocket of the barn coat and Barley trotting along beside her, and she stood at the edge of that sandy ground and looked at it for a long time. Then she started to dig. It was harder than she thought. The sand gave way easy enough, but the spring sun hadn't softened all of it, and her hands blistered before noon. She didn't have a planter or a tractor or any real idea what she was doing. She just remembered her mother kneeling in the garden every May, pushing each seed down to the first knuckle and patting the dirt over it like she was tucking it in. So Della did that. One seed, one knuckle, one pat. Then another, down the row and back, on her knees in her dead mother's coat, while the dog lay in the turned dirt and watched her. By the time the light went orange, she had planted maybe a quarter of the patch. Her knees were soaked through. Her hands were raw, and for the first time in 6 weeks, the awful weight in her chest had loosened just enough to let her breathe, because for a few hours that afternoon it had felt like her mother was kneeling right there beside her. She came back the next day, and the next. It took her most of a week. Barley stayed with her the whole time. He dug his own holes alongside hers, no good to anybody, sand flying out between his back legs, and then he'd flop down in the cool dirt and watch her work with his chin on his paws. When she got too tired to go on, he would come and press his big warm side against her, and she'd lean into him and rest a minute, and then she'd go back to it. He was the one creature on the whole place who never once told her she was being foolish. It was Garrett Voss who saw her first. Voss farmed the biggest operation in the county, 2,000 acres of corn and beans wrapped around 3 sides of the Brandt place, and he drove the roads like he owned them, which mostly he did. His pickup slowed at the fence line on the 3rd or 4th day, and the window came down, and he sat there with his elbow out, watching a little girl on her knees in the sand. "What are you doing down there?" he called. Della stood up. "Planting." "Planting what?" "Sunflowers." Voss laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly. Worse than cruel even. It was the laugh of a man who had just heard the funniest, saddest thing all week and couldn't decide which it was. "Sunflowers." He shook his head. "Honey, this is corn country. Your daddy know you're down here wasting good seed dirt on weeds?" "They're not weeds," Della said. "And it's not good dirt. Nothing grows here." "Then what makes you think flowers will?" She didn't have an answer for that. She just looked at him until he got tired of waiting for one, and the window went up and the truck rolled on and she heard the laugh again through the glass. By the next morning, the whole county knew. That was how it worked in a town that small. Voss told it at the co-op leaning on the counter while the men waited on their seed orders. And the men told it at the diner, and by the time the school bus came around, Della could feel it before anybody said a word. The air around her had gone strange and watchful. The other kids looked at her sideways and whispered. Wyatt Voss said it out loud. He was 11, a year ahead of her, and he had his father's easy laugh and his father's certainty that the world ran exactly how the Vosses said it ran. "Hey," he said, loud enough for the whole bus. "It's the sunflower girl." At recess, he wouldn't let it go. He came across the gravel with 2 other boys trailing behind him and stood over her where she sat against the brick wall. "My dad says your dad's about to lose the farm," Wyatt said. "Says you're down there playing in the dirt while he goes broke." Della kept her eyes on the ground. "They're my mother's. They're weeds. They're sunflowers. Same thing." She looked up at him then. "Your dad's scared of them. That's why he keeps talking about them." Wyatt's face went red. For a second, she thought he might shove her. Instead, he laughed too loud and turned and walked off with his boys, and the name followed her down every hallway for the rest of the year. By lunch, it had stuck to her like a burr, and it didn't come off for a long time. Della didn't cry about it. She was all cried out for the year, she figured. So she sat in the back of the bus that afternoon with her forehead against the cold window and thought about the seeds in the ground and how none of these kids had ever knelt next to their mother in the dirt, and how if planting flowers was the dumbest thing in the world, then she would rather be the dumbest girl in the county than be like them. But her father was a different matter. He came home that evening from a long day of working ground on the other side of the place, and he walked down to check the creek pump, and that was when he saw it. the turned earth, those neat little rows, the empty paper seed packets she'd weighed down with a rock so they wouldn't blow away. Della watched from the kitchen window. She saw him stop. His shoulders went stiff. He crouched down and picked up one of the packets and turned it over in his hand, and even from that far away she just knew that he had recognized her mother's handwriting on the tin she'd left sitting in the dirt. He stood there a long time. Then he came up to the house slow, and the back door opened, and he set the empty tin on the kitchen table without a word. Della. Yeah, tell me what that is down by the creek. She lifted her chin. Sunflowers. I planted them. I can see that. Why? Because Mama told me to. Something crossed his face then, a flash of hurt that was hard to look at, and for a second she thought he might sit down and put his head in his hands, the same as she had caught him doing once when he didn't know she was up. But he didn't. He set his jaw, and the hurt iced over and went hard. Your mother's gone, he said, and his voice was rough. And that ground is for corn. It won't grow corn, you always said. It'll grow corn before it grows that. You know what we're up against right now? You have any idea? He pulled the chair out and sat down heavy and rubbed his face with both hands. I sat across from a man today who's got our whole life on a piece of paper in a folder. The whole place. And he's not in a smiling mood. We are behind, Della. We don't have room for foolishness. We don't have room for flowers. They were hers, Della said. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. She saved those seeds. She left a note. And she wanted them planted where the corn won't grow, and that's the only place I planted them. I'm not pulling them up. Ray looked at her for a long moment across that kitchen table, his dead wife's tin sitting empty between them. Whatever he was going to say, he didn't say it. He just got up and went to the sink and ran the water and stood there with his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling. You'll see, he said finally. Nothing's going to come up, and then we'll plow it under and put it to corn like everything else, and that'll be the end of it. Della didn't answer. She took the tin off the table and held it against her chest and went up to her room, and that night she put it under her pillow where she could feel the cool shape of it through the cotton, and Barley pushed the door open and laid his head on her bed, and she slept. For 11 days, nothing happened. Her father was right, and she could see him being right every time he glanced down toward the creek. The sand sat there bare and rumpled where she'd worked it. The other fields started to green up with the neighbors' corn coming through in clean, machine-straight rows, and the South Five stayed empty, and Wyatt Voss kept calling her the Sunflower Girl. And Della started to wonder if she had buried her mother's last gift in dead ground for nothing. On the 12th morning, she went down before the bus, the same as every morning, to check. The light was gray and low, and the dew was heavy on the sand. She almost missed them. She had to get down on her knees and put her face close to see, and there they were, all up and down her crooked little rows. Hundreds of them, pale green shoots no taller than her thumb, each one bent over like it was bowing, pushing the last of the seed husk up out of the dirt on its back. Alive. In the ground everyone swore was dead. In the corner her father cussed and the rich man laughed at. Her mother's seeds were alive and coming up to find the sun. Della knelt there in the wet sand and didn't go to school. She heard the bus come and slow and honk and finally pull away without her. She didn't care. One finger reached out and touched the nearest chute, soft as a baby's hand, and the loose thing in her chest came apart all the way, and she let it. Behind her, up by the barn, she heard the screen door and then her father's boots stopping short on the gravel. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. From the top of the slope she could feel him standing there, looking down at 5 acres of impossible green, holding his cap in his hands and saying nothing at all. Ray didn't say a word about the sprouts. Not that morning, and not the next. He went back to his own planting, climbing into the cab before light and coming home after dark, putting the rest of the place to corn and beans like he did every year. But Della noticed he stopped driving the tractor across the South 5 on his way to the creek pump. He went around it now, the long way. She didn't know what that meant, only that it meant something. The chutes climbed fast once they got going. Inside of 2 weeks they were past her ankles, broadleafed and bristly, leaning all of them in the same direction every morning. Their little green heads turned east to catch the first light. By the end of May, they were past her knees. The neighbor's corn was up too, knife straight and uniform, marching off in every direction to the edge of the county, and in the middle of all that order sat Della's crooked, leaning, stubborn 5 acres of something else. She tended it before school and after. Creek water went up the slope in a bucket whenever the top inch of sand went dry. She pulled the foxtail and the pigweed by hand, on her knees with Barley flopped in the dirt beside her chewing on a stick. The kids still called her the Sunflower Girl. She had mostly stopped hearing it. It was a Saturday in early June when she looked up from the rows and found an old woman standing at the fence watching her. Della hadn't heard her come. She was small and folded-looking, in a man's flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, a flat metal hive tool poking out of her apron pocket. Della knew who she was. Everybody did. Sigrid kept bees on the next place over, had kept them as long as anyone could remember, and lived alone at the end of a lane nobody had reason to drive down. "You planted these," Sigrid said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "By yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." The old woman ducked through the fence wire slow and careful, and came out among the rows. She bent down at one of the plants and turned a leaf over and looked at the underside of it, and then she straightened up and looked out over the whole patch, and a look went across her face that Della couldn't read. "You know what brought me up here," Sigrid said. "My bees. I've kept hives down that lane 40 years, and lately they've been dying on me. Starving. You'd think with 2,000 acres of crop all around, a bee couldn't go hungry. But corn don't feed a bee. Beans don't either. There's nothing out there for them anymore. Mile after mile of green, and it might as well be a parking lot." She nodded out at Della's field. "Then 3 days ago my girls came home heavy, loaded down. I followed them, and they brought me here." Della looked at the plants. There were bees on them, she realized. Dozens. Working the rows in the morning sun, busy and loud. "Bees don't lie," Sigrid said. "They go where the living is, and there's nothing living in a corn row." She gave Della a long look. Now where would a child get a notion to plant sunflowers in the middle of corn country? "My mother left me the seed," Della said. "She left a note that said to plant them where the corn won't grow, so I did." The old woman went still. "Your mother," she said. "Marlene. You knew her." "I sold her the seed." Sigrid sat down on an upturned bucket Della used for hauling, and she was quiet a moment. "3 springs ago she came down my lane, which nobody does, and knocked on my door and asked if I had open-pollinated sunflower seed, the old kind, not the hybrid the co-op sells. We sat at my table half the afternoon. She wanted to know about the bees, about what the land used to grow before it all went to corn. She had ideas, your mother, big ones." She looked at Della. "She told me about this exact corner, the Sandy 5, said her husband swore at it every August. Said it was the most honest piece of ground on the whole place, because it wouldn't pretend to be something it wasn't." Della's throat went tight. Nobody had said her mother's name out loud, like she was a real person and not a hole in the middle of everything, in a long time. "She talked to you a lot?" Della asked. "Enough that I missed her when she stopped coming." Sigrid said it plain. She didn't dress it up. "I heard she passed. I'm sorry, child. She was the only person in this county in 20 years who came down my lane to ask me a question instead of to complain about my bees in their garden." They sat a while in the loud, sunny field. Then Sigrid asked a question that changed the shape of the whole summer. "Did she leave you her book?" Della frowned. "What book?" "Your mother wrote everything down. Carried a notebook around. Soil notes, what she planted where, what the weather did. She showed it to me once. Drew me a map of this corner right there at my table." Sigrid studied Della's blank face. "You never saw it?" "No, ma'am." "Then I'd look," the old woman said, getting up off the bucket with a hand on her knee. "A woman who plans that careful doesn't keep the plan only in her head. It's in the house somewhere. Find it." She started back toward the fence, then stopped. "And keep that water on them till the roots take. After that, you can quit. Bees don't need babying like corn. A sunflower sends a root straight down, deep as the plant is tall, sometimes deeper. It goes looking for water the corn can't reach. It doesn't fight a dry spell. It goes down after what it needs and keeps its head up top." She looked back over her shoulder. "Your mother knew that. It's why she picked them." Then she ducked through the wire and was gone down the lane, and Della stood in the field with the bees roaring around her and a new thing in her chest that wasn't grief, for once. It felt closer to a door coming open. She tore the house apart looking for the book. She went through the kitchen drawers and the desk in the front room and the boxes in the closet that nobody had touched since the funeral. Inside them were her mother's recipe cards and church bulletins and a shoebox of photographs that she had to put down halfway through because her eyes blurred too bad to see. In the nightstand drawer, she found a second pair of reading glasses, the ones she thought her father carried in his pocket. But no book. She found it in the truck. It was tucked up under the bench seat of her mother's old pickup, the one that hadn't moved from the machine shed since February, wrapped in a plastic bread bag to keep the damp off. A fat spiral notebook with a cardboard cover gone soft at the corners. Della climbed up into the cab, where the air still smelled faintly of her mother's hand lotion, and she opened it on the steering wheel and started to read. It was all there, in the same slanted hand as the note, pages of it. Soil notes from the South. 5, the dates her mother had dug little holes and felt the dirt and written down what she found. Sand to 18 inches. Won't hold a rain. Corn's been failing here 9 years running. Why do we keep fighting it? There were drawings. A map of the sandy corner with the creek along the bottom and arrows showing how the water ran off. Lists of seed varieties with prices next to them. Little stars by the one she liked best. And there were the other things. The things Della was too young to fully understand that June but old enough to know were important. A name and a phone number circled twice, with 3 words beside it: birdseed and oil. A folded paper, soft and official-looking, from some program with a long name about soil and conservation. Her mother's handwriting in the margin. Applied March. Fingers crossed. Numbers Della couldn't follow. Dollars and acres and yields. All worked out in pencil down the side of a page. Like her mother had been doing the same math her father did at the kitchen table, only she had come to a different answer. Her mother hadn't been planting flowers, she had been planting a way out, and she had run out of time before she could show anyone. Della closed the book and held it against her chest in the cab of the dead truck, and understood for the first time that the seeds weren't a goodbye. They were a job. Her mother had handed her a job, and trusted her to finish it without ever being able to explain. The next afternoon, Della carried the notebook down the lane to Sigrid's place, past the white bee boxes humming in the heat, and she showed her the page with the name circled twice and the 3 words beside it. Bird, seed, and oil, Sigrid read. She tapped the phone number. That's a real buyer, child. Sunflowers aren't just a pretty face. You press the seed and you get oil. You bag the seed and you feed every cardinal and chickadee in 3 states all winter. There's folks who'd pay good money for a clean field of these, and not many growing them around here. She handed the book back. Your mother did her homework. Everybody says it's going to be dry, Della said. It is going to be dry. Sigrid looked at her, and a dry smile pulled at the creases of her face. And that's the joke of it. A wet year, corn beats a sunflower every time. But a dry year is exactly what your mother was planting for. She wasn't betting against the rain coming. She was betting against it staying. Della thought about that the whole walk home. She didn't tell her father about the book. Not yet. She told herself it was because she didn't have the words. The truer reason was that she had heard him on the phone the night before, late when he thought she was asleep, and the sound of his voice had scared her. He had been talking to the bank. After that, things got harder before they got better. They always do. Garrett Voss came up the drive on a Tuesday evening near the end of June. Della was at the kitchen sink, and she watched his big clean truck pull in next to her father's dirty one, watched Voss get out and hitch his pants and look around the yard like he already owned it. She turned off the water so she could hear. Her father met him out by the gate. They were too far off for every word, but the evening was still and the windows were open and pieces of it carried up to the house. Not here to make trouble, Ray. I'm here to do you a favor. Voss had a big, easy voice that carried whether you wanted it to or not. Everybody knows where you're at. No shame in it. Bad couple years and then you lose Marlene, God rest her. Any man would be underwater. Her father said something she couldn't catch. The south ground especially, Voss went on. That sandy piece never made you a dime and you know it. Square it onto my pivot and it'd at least be worth something. I'll give you a fair number for the whole quarter down there. Take the weight off. You could make your payment and breathe. More from her father, low. What flowers? Voss laughed, and the laugh carried clear as a bell. That what this is? Ray, come on. You're gonna let a little girl's flower patch keep you from saving your place? They're talking dry all summer. The radio's saying it. You want to gamble the whole farm on a kid and a bucket of weeds, or you want to be smart. Della's hands were wet and cold on the edge of the sink. She didn't hear what her father answered, but she saw Voss clap him on the shoulder like the deal was halfway done, and she saw her father stand there after the big truck pulled out. Not moving, looking down the slope toward the creek where the sunflowers were closing up their heads for the night. He came in slow. He didn't take his boots off, just stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and his face was so tired she almost couldn't be mad at him. You heard that, he said. Some of it. He's not wrong, Della, about the money. I want you to understand that the man's a lot of things, but he's not wrong about where we're at. Ray pulled off his cap and turned it in his hands. If this corn don't make this year, we could lose the place. Not the South 5. the place, the house, all of it. You're old enough to hear that, so I'm telling you straight. Mama had a plan, Della said. His eyes flickered. Your mother had a lot of plans. A real one. For that ground, the sunflowers are worth something. There's a man who buys them, she wrote it all. Don't! His voice cracked like a dry branch and she stopped. He shut his eyes. When he opened them again, he had them back under control, but it had cost him. I can't, Della. I can't do this with her. Every time I look down that hill, I see her standing at this window, telling me that ground's trying to talk to me, and I cannot bury my whole family chasing something a dead woman dreamed up. You understand me? I got to think about right now. I got to keep a roof over your head. They'll stand, Della said quietly. She said they'd stand. They're not weeds. They're hers. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his cap back on and went out to the barn and didn't come in for supper, and Della sat alone at the table with her mother's empty chair across from her, and didn't eat either. The rain that had come easy all spring quit coming. It wasn't sudden. June had given them a couple of good soakers, enough to bring the corn up thick and green and fool everybody into hoping. But the last week of June went by dry, and then the first week of July, and the men at the co-op started saying the word out loud, careful. Like saying it too loud might make it true. The sky stayed a high, hard blue, day after day, and the wind came out of the south hot and steady and pulled the moisture out of the topsoil a little more every afternoon. Della kept hauling water. Sigrid had said she could quit once the roots took, but she didn't, not all the way. She gave them a little, and the sunflowers, deep-rooted and patient, didn't seem to notice the sky had gone stingy. They climbed past her waist, then up to her shoulder. They set their buds, fat green fists at the top of every stalk, getting ready to open. The corn started to notice, though. By the middle of July, you could see it in the heat of the afternoon, the leaves on the neighbor's corn rolling up tight like green cigars to save themselves, going gray-blue in the worst of the sun. It would relax again in the cool of the evening. But every day it took a little longer to relax, and every morning it looked a little more tired. One night, Della couldn't sleep. The house was hot and still. She got the notebook out from under her mattress where it lived now next to the seed tin, and turned the soft pages by the light of her bedside lamp, reading her mother's notes for the 100th time, hunting for the part of the plan she hadn't figured out yet. The part that came after the flowers stood. That was when the back cover fell open in her hands and she saw it. There was a pocket inside the back cover sized for loose papers. Della had looked in it before. It had held the conservation flyer and a seed receipt. But the flyer had been folded over something, and now, with the notebook open flat, it slid halfway out on its own. An envelope, plain, white, gone a little yellow at the edges, sealed, never opened. And across the front, in her mother's slanting hand, pressed down hard, the pen biting deep into the paper because the words behind it were heavy, was one word: Ray. Della didn't open it. She sat on her bed a long time with the envelope in her lap and held it up to the lamp once to see if she could read the shadow of the words inside. She couldn't. It was thick, 2 pages, maybe 3. Her name wasn't on the front. Her father's was, and as bad as she wanted to know what her mother's last words to him said, she understood they weren't hers to read, so she kept it. She slid it back into the notebook's pocket and put the notebook under her mattress next to the seed tin, and she promised herself she'd give it to him at the right time, when he was ready, when he quit looking at the field like it was something she was doing to him on purpose. The trouble was, he only got further away. July burnt down into August, and the rain never came back. 40 days, the men at the co-op started counting. Then 50. The sky went from a friendly blue to a hard white, and the dust hung over every gravel road in the county long after the truck that raised it was gone. The ditches that should have been green were the color of a paper bag. People stopped washing their cars because what was the point? The corn went first at the edges, then everywhere. By the second week of August, the neighbors' fields had stopped being green at all. The stalks stood waist-high and tan and rattling tasseled out too short, the ears that had set turning to nubbins inside their husks. A grown man could walk into the middle of a 100-acre field and not be able to see over the top of a crop that should have been a foot above his head. You could hear it in the wind, a dry, papery hiss, mile after mile, like the whole county had turned to cornflakes. The insurance adjusters came around in white pickups with clipboards. Della saw one of them standing in the Voss's field across the road, snapping pictures, shaking his head. She heard her father on the phone with their own agent, his voice flat and far away, saying, "Yes, total loss. Yes, I understand. No, there's nothing to do but file." And down by the creek, on 5 acres of sand nobody had wanted, the sunflowers stood up green. They were taller than Della now, taller than her father, a wall of thick hairy stalks with leaves as big as dinner plates, and buds at the top of each, one fattening toward the sky. They didn't roll their leaves in the afternoon. They didn't go gray. They stood there in the killing heat, fed by roots that had gone down past where the corn could reach, drinking from water the rest of the county couldn't touch. Sigrid had told her to mulch them, and she had, dragging dried grass from the ditches and packing it thick around the stalks to hold what little moisture there was. But the truth was, they barely needed her anymore. They were doing exactly what her mother said they would do. The first head opened on a Sunday morning. Della came down at dawn, and there it was, the tallest one in the front row, its green buds split open into a ring of yellow petals around a brown center, turned to the east to meet the sun coming up. By noon, there were a dozen. By the end of the week, there were hundreds. A wave of them opening day after day, and the bees came in such numbers that you could hear the field humming from the top of the slope. People started slowing down on the road. It was hard not to. You'd drive past a mile of dead tan corn and another mile of dead tan corn, and then you'd come over the little rise by the Brandt place, and there, down in the sandy bottom, would be 5 acres of green and gold standing up like the drought had simply forgotten that one corner existed. Cars that never had reason to slow slowed. A few people stopped at the fence and just looked. Sigrid came near every day now, walking up the lane with her hat on, and she and Della would stand at the edge of the rows in the early cool while the bees worked. "You know what your mother told me that day at my table," Sigrid said one morning. I asked her why sunflowers of all things, in a county that had laughed her off the road for it, and she said, "Anybody can grow what everybody grows. It takes something braver to grow what you believe in." The old woman watched the bees a while. She believed in this. Right here. She just didn't get the chance to be right out loud. "She's being right now," Della said. "She surely is." If you've stayed with Della's story this far, take a second to subscribe, because what happened next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the night the whole thing nearly ended, down in the dirt, between a broken man and his daughter. And it started, as these things do, in town. Ray went to the co-op on a Thursday for a part he needed, and he made the mistake of going in the late afternoon when the men were standing around. He heard them before they saw him. Somebody was telling it, the sunflower thing, and there was laughing, and then somebody said, careful and low but not low enough, that at least one brand had figured out how to grow something this year, and wasn't it a shame it took a 10-year-old to do it? And then they saw him in the doorway and went quiet. Garrett Voss was at the counter. He had the decency to look away, but the damage was done. "Ray," Voss said, following him out to the lot, "don't pay them any mind. Look, that offer's still good. Matter of fact, I need to know something soon because the bank's going to want to see a plan from you before the note comes due, and I can be that plan. You sign the South Quarter to me, you make your payment, you keep your house. I'm trying to throw you a rope here." "And the flowers?" Ray said. "The what?" "You want it clean. The South Quarter. You want it disked under and squared off for your pivot." Voss spread his hands like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "It's weeds, Ray. It's a kid's flower patch on ground that won't grow a crop. Course I want it clean. You can't be hauling a circus around down there. Come on. You're a serious man. Let's do serious business." Ray drove home with his jaw set and his dead wife's reading glasses riding in his shirt pocket and every laugh from that co-op going around and around in his head. He didn't come in for supper. Della heard the tractor start up in the machine shed a little before dark, and she heard the rattle of the disc being hooked up, and she knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your brain catches up, exactly where he was going with it. She ran. She ran down the slope in her bare feet with Barley barking beside her, and she got to the bottom just as the tractor came around the corner of the field, with its lights on and the big disc lowered behind it, the gangs of blades ready to chew the first row of sunflowers down into the sand. Della ran straight in front of it, into the rows, and she stood there in the headlights with her arms out, her mother's flowers towering over her on every side, and she screamed at him to stop. The tractor stopped. For a long, terrible moment, nothing moved but the dust in the headlight beams. Then the door of the cab opened, and her father climbed down, and his face in the worklights was something Della had never seen on him, not even at the funeral. He looked wild. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose, which is the most dangerous kind of man there is. "Get out of the field, Della." "No. Get out of the field. You don't understand. This is how I keep the house. This is the only way left. You want to sleep in the truck this winter?" You want that?" His voice broke open. "I can't do it. I can't keep looking at it. The whole county's laughing at us, and every time I see it, I see her, and I can't. I cannot." "Then look at it," Della shouted back, and she was crying now, but she didn't move. "Everybody else's corn is dead. Everybody's. And hers is standing. You said nothing would grow here. You said it. And she knew better. She knew better than all of you, and you're going to kill the one thing she got to be right about because some men at the co-op laughed at you." He took a step toward her. Behind her, Barley stopped barking and went still, and Della heard the old dog growl low, once, a sound he had never made at her father in his life. Ray heard it too. He stopped. "They're hers," Della said. "Quieter now. Plant them where the corn won't grow." That's what she wrote. That's the last thing she ever told me to do, and I did it, and they stood. "Don't, Daddy. Please don't." Ray stood in the headlights with 3 rows torn up behind the disc, and his daughter in front of it and his old dog between them, and the fight went out of him all at once. He sat down, right there in the dirt at the end of the row, like his legs had quit, and he put his face in his hands, and he made a sound Della had only heard once before, through a closed door the night her mother died. She went and got the letter. She didn't say anything about it. She just turned and ran back up to the house in the dark and dug the notebook out from under her mattress and pulled the yellowed envelope from the pocket. And she ran back down the slope and put it in his hands where he sat in the dirt. "She left this for you," Della said. "In her book. I never opened it. It's got your name on it." Ray looked at the envelope a long time. He turned it over and saw the one word on the front in Marlene's hand, and his thumb moved across it like he could feel the letters. Then he broke the seal, and he tipped it toward the tractor lights, and he read. Della couldn't see the words from where she stood, but she watched her father's face read them, and that was enough. She watched the wildness drain out of it. She watched his mouth go soft and then crumple. She watched a tear cut a clean line down through the field dust on his cheek and drop off his jaw onto the page. The letter was dated the week before Marlene went into the hospital for the last time. Later, much later, Ray would read parts of it out loud to Della, and she would learn what it said. It said she was sorry. Sorry to be leaving him the books and the bank and all of it with her gone. It said the sunflowers weren't a whim and weren't a goodbye. They were a plan, a real one. The one she'd been trying to talk to him about for 3 years while he told her she was just missing North Dakota. It said the Sandy Five would never make corn, and they both knew it, but it would make sunflowers, drought or no drought, and there was a man 2 counties over who paid cash for the seed, for birdseed and oil, and she'd already started the paperwork on a grant that would pay them to do it. It said, the part that put him in the dirt. I know you, Ray Brandt. I know that when I'm gone you'll want to put your head down and grind and sell off whatever's hardest to look at. And the thing that's hardest to look at will be the thing I planted, because it'll have my fingerprints all over it. Don't. Please don't. Trust the ground. Trust Della. She listens better than either of us ever did. And it said, at the end, a sunflower doesn't fight a dry year. It just roots deeper and keeps its face to the light. Be a sunflower, my love, for her. Ray folded the letter back along its creases with hands that weren't steady. He looked up at his daughter, standing barefoot in the torn dirt with the flowers black against the last of the sky behind her. And for the first time since the casseroles, since the frozen ground, since the hole in the middle of everything, he really looked at her. Your mother saw a year I couldn't, he said, his voice wrecked. And she planted for it anyway. Della didn't trust herself to talk. She just nodded. Ray got up off the ground slow, like an old man, and he walked back to the tractor and reached into the cab and shut it off. The headlights died. The field went dark and quiet except for the wind moving through the tall stalks and the creek running low at the bottom of the slope. He stood there in the sudden dark with the letter in his hand and the 3 torn rows behind him, looking out over all the rest of them. The hundreds and hundreds still standing, their heads closed up for the night and turned toward an east where the sun hadn't come up yet but would. He didn't move for a long time. Della went and stood beside him, and Barley came and leaned against them both, and none of the 3 of them said a word. They were back in the field before the sun was all the way up. Ray hadn't slept. Della found him down there at first light, on his knees in the 3 torn rows, trying to stand the broken stalks back up and bank the sand around their roots with his bare hands. Most of them were too far gone, snapped off clean by the disc, but a few had only been knocked sideways, and he was setting those right one at a time. Careful, his big hands gentle on stems he'd come down to destroy 12 hours before. Della knelt down beside him without a word and started doing the same. They worked like that a while, side by side in the cool, and then Ray said, Not looking at her, she wanted to take me to North Dakota the first fall we were married, to see the harvest up there. Whole counties of these things, she said, far as you could see, all of them facing the same way at sunup like a crowd waiting on something. He patted the sand down around her route. I never took her, always too busy, always next year. His voice went thick. There wasn't a next year. There's never as many next years as you think. She showed me this corner once, Della said. Said there were things that loved ground like this. I didn't know what she meant. Neither did I. Ray sat back on his heels and looked out over the rows. Hundreds of gold faces all turned east into the new light. She knew. She knew the whole time, and I called it homesickness. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I'm sorry, Della. I should have been down here with you in May. I left you to do it alone. You're here now. I'm here now, he agreed. That afternoon, he made a phone call. Della sat at the kitchen table and watched him dial the number from the notebook, the one her mother had circled twice, and she watched his face while a man 2 counties over talked into his ear for a long time. When Ray hung up, he sat there with his hand still on the phone. Well, he said, that fellow about drove off the road when I told him how many acres I had standing. He looked dazed. Says the dry took out near every sunflower field in the state. Says clean seed's worth more this year than he's seen it in 20. Says he'll send his own crew and his own combine to cut it, and he'll pay on the truck scale, and he wants every head we can give him. Ray named the number the man had quoted, the per-pound price, and then the number it came to across 5 acres, and the kitchen went very quiet. It was more than the corn would have made in a good year, on the worst ground on the place, in the worst drought anybody could remember. That's not all of it either, Della said. She got up and brought him the notebook and turned to the folded conservation paper. She applied for this in March, before. Ray read it twice. He didn't say anything. He took Marlene's reading glasses out of his shirt pocket, the ones he carried everywhere and thought nobody knew about, and he put them on to read it a third time, and Della understood that he wasn't reading it for the words anymore. The letter from the program came 4 days later, addressed to Marlene Brandt, and Ray opened it standing at the mailbox. It was an approval. The grant she'd put in for, the one that paid a farmer to put failing ground into pollinator habitat and soil cover, had come through. There was a number on it, paid per acre, and when Ray added it to what the buyer had promised and set the total against the figure the man at the bank had been holding over them all summer, the math came out on the right side of the line for the first time in 3 years. He sat down at the kitchen table that night with a pencil and the notebook and did the figures over, slow, the same figures in his dead wife's hand running down the margin of the page beside his. He had told her she was dreaming. She had been doing arithmetic the whole time. She did it, he said. She saved the place. From the grave, she saved the place. He looked up at Della, and there were tears standing in his eyes, but he was almost smiling, which was a thing Della hadn't seen since winter. Your mother saved us with a flower. The flowers, by then, had taken over the whole bottom of the farm. 5 acres of sunflowers in full bloom is a thing that doesn't belong to a dry August, and the whole county knew it. They stood 7 and 8 feet tall, thousands of heads the size of dinner plates, every one of them gold around a dark center. Every one of them turned to follow the sun across the white sky. The bees worked them from first light. Goldfinches hung off the heads and scattered up in yellow handfuls when you walked the rows. And around all of it, to the edge of the world in every direction, lay the dead tan corn, rattling and ruined. The cars didn't just slow down now, they stopped. Whole families got out and stood at the fence in the evenings to look at the one green and gold thing left in a burned-up county, and some of them took pictures, and a few of them, the older ones, took their hats off without seeming to know they'd done it. Garrett Voss came back on a Sunday. Della saw the big truck pull in, slower than it used to, and she saw Voss get out and stand there a minute before he came to the gate. He looked smaller than he had in June. His 2,000 acres of corn were a total loss, every one. And word was his operation was leveraged to the rafters and his own banker wasn't sleeping either. He took off his cap when Ray walked out, which Della had never once seen him do. Ray. Voss turned his cap in his hands. I'll keep it short. That offer I made you, forget it. I couldn't make good on it now if you said yes, and we both know it. He looked down the slope at the blaze of gold along the creek, and something worked in his jaw. I came to say I was wrong. About the ground. About the flowers. About the girl. He found Della at the fence and met her eyes, and it cost him, you could see it cost him. I called it foolishness. Turns out the child could read the sky better than the rest of us. Ray didn't gloat. He could have, half the county would have, in his boots after the summer he'd had. Instead, he leaned on the gate next to the man who'd tried to buy his land out from under him and said, "It wasn't the girl, Garrett, it was her mother." Della just had the nerve to finish it. He was quiet a second. "You want to walk down and see them up close?" And the biggest corn farmer in the county walked down into a 10-year-old's flower patch with his cap in his hand and stood among the rows while the bees roared around him, and he didn't say anything at all for a long while. Wyatt came on his bike 2 days after that. He left it lying in the ditch and stood at the fence a long time before Della went over. He wouldn't quite look at her. He had a way of scuffing the dirt with his shoe that reminded her he was only 11, same as the rest of them, even with that loud laugh he borrowed off his father. "They're real tall," he said finally. "Yeah, I'm sorry I called you that. The sunflower girl." He scuffed the dirt some more. "The whole bus did it because I started it." "So, sorry." Della looked at him a moment. "You can come see them if you want." He ducked through the fence so fast he nearly fell, and the two of them walked the rows, and Wyatt kept reaching up to touch the big heads and pull his hand back, until Della told him it was all right. They were tough, you couldn't hurt them. He picked up a goldfinch feather off the sand and put it in his pocket like it was worth something. When he left, he asked, careful if maybe she had any extra seed, because his mom had a flower bed that never did much. And Della said she'd see. The buyer's crew came the last week of August to set up for the cut. It would take them a single long day with the right header on the combine, the man had said, but there was more to ready than Della expected. And Sigrid came up to help, and so did two of the neighbors who had stood at the fence taking pictures, now asking quietly if there was anything they could do. Word had gone around. It had changed shape somewhere along the way, from that fool Brandt girl in her weeds into the only crop that made it through, and the difference was the difference between being laughed at and being seen. The night before the harvest, Ray and Della sat on the back step in the dark and listened to the dry wind move through the field they were about to cut. 80-some days now, Ray said, since the last rain. They're saying it'll go to 90 before it breaks. He shook his head slow. Every blade of corn in this county dead in the ground, and we're about to bring in a crop off the South 5. If somebody told me that in March, I'd have laughed at them too. Mama wouldn't have laughed, Della said. No. He put his arm around her, which he hadn't done in a long time, and she leaned into him, and below them the thousands of heads stood black against the last gray light. Closed up for the night, every one of them already turned toward the place where the morning would come. No, she wouldn't have. She'd have just said she told me so, and then she'd have made me coffee. They sat there a while longer, and then, down at the end of the drive, a pair of headlights swung in off the county road and came slowly toward the house. And Ray stood up, squinting, because they were not expecting anybody, and it was getting on toward dark. It was Garrett Voss. He pulled up by the gate and got out slow and left his lights on, and for a second Ray just stood on the step waiting, because the last time those headlights had come down the drive, they'd been attached to a man trying to talk him out of his land. Didn't mean to come at dark, Voss said. I'll be quick. He hooked his thumbs in his pockets and looked at the ground and then made himself look up. You're cutting tomorrow. Whole county knows. I got 2 grain trucks sitting empty in my yard and a crew of men I'm paying to do nothing, because there's not a kernel of corn worth running a combine through for 40 miles. He cleared his throat. I'd like to bring them over. Haul your seed to the scale for you. No charge. It'd be the first useful thing any of us has done all summer. Ray was quiet a moment. You don't have to do that, Garrett. I know I don't. Voss looked down the dark slope toward the field he couldn't see anymore but knew was there. My daddy farmed that ground across the road 40 years and his daddy before him, and not one of us ever once asked what the land wanted. We just told it. Year after year we told it corn, and it did its best to oblige us, right up until the sky quit. He shook his head. Your little girl asked. That's the whole difference, isn't it? She asked. So in the morning they all came. The buyer's combine rolled in at first light with a header built for sunflowers, wide and toothed, and behind it came Voss's 2 trucks and Voss's crew, and behind them, in 1s and 2s down the county road, came the neighbors. Some Della knew, and some she didn't. The 2 who had stopped to take pictures. A man who farmed north of town who'd heard at the co-op and brought his wife in a thermos of coffee. The school teacher, Sigrid, walking up the lane in her cut-off flannel with her hat on. Even Wyatt, dropped off by his mother, who stayed. They had come to help bring in 5 acres of flowers, and not one of them was laughing. Before the combine started, Della walked down into the rows alone. She had her mother's hoe in one hand, though there was nothing left to hoe and the rusted tin in her coat pocket, empty now. She stopped at the tallest plant in the front row, the first one that had opened back in July, its head gone heavy and brown and bowed under the weight of 1,000 seeds. She bent the stalk down and worked a knife around the base of the head and cut it free, and she shook the loose seed out into the tin until it was full again, the same striped gray seed her mother had left her, grown out and given back. She closed the lid. She stood there a minute with her hand flat on the warm head of the next flower over, the bees still working all around her like none of this was ending, and she said quiet so only the field could hear it, "We did it, Mama." They stood. Then she walked back up the slope, and she gave her father a nod, and the combine fired up and rolled into the rows. It took most of the day. The seed came pouring out of the auger into Voss's trucks in a gray-brown river, head after head after head. 5 acres of it, the harvest off a corner of ground that had never paid for its own seed corn in 9 tries. The men hauled load after load to the scale at the elevator and brought back the weight tickets, and every ticket was a number, and the numbers added up all afternoon. And by the time the sun went down, the math that Della's mother had worked out in pencil in the margin of a notebook had come true on a truck scale for everyone to see. The buyer paid on the seed the way he said he would. When you set it against the grant the program had approved and put the whole of it across the desk from the man at the bank, it was enough. Enough to make the payment that was due. Enough to keep the house and the barn and the rest of the ground and the name on the mailbox. Enough that Ray Brandt drove home from town with the folder closed for good and had to pull over on the county road for a minute before he could see well enough to keep driving. The rain came 3 days after the last of the seed was in. It had been 91 days. People had stopped believing it would ever happen. And then, one evening, the sky went green-gray in the west, and the wind shifted, and it came down in sheets, drumming on the roof, running in the dry ditches, far too late to save a single acre of anyone's corn. Della stood out on the porch and let it soak her, and her father came and stood beside her, and neither of them said it was funny, but they were both thinking it. The rain had waited until the only field that didn't need it was already in the bin. The next spring, the South 5 went to sunflowers on purpose. So did a strip along the road on the north place across the way, because Garrett Voss had asked Ray that fall if he could buy a sack of seed, and the two of them had stood at the kitchen table working out which open-pollinated kind did best on sandy ground, while Della listened and Barley snored under the table. The co-op started writing sunflower contracts that winter, careful at first, then less careful when the orders came in. Sigrid's hives came through the cold, heavy, and strong for the first time in years, and she split them in the spring and gave a new colony to the school teacher, who had decided the children ought to grow something that fed the bees. The school planted a row of sunflowers along the fence by the playground that May. The same kids who had ridden the bus calling Della inane planted them, on their knees in the dirt, and nobody thought it was foolish, because by then everybody in the county had seen what foolish looked like, and it looked like a burned-up field of dead corn next to 5 acres of gold. Della kept the tin full. That was the part she decided on her own. Whatever the field made, she always cut a few of the best heads by hand first and saved the seed back the way her mother had, and the tin sat under her pillow through the winter and came out every spring. When Wyatt's mother wanted seed for her flower bed, Della gave it to her out of the tin. When a family 2 roads over lost their place anyway, drought and debt and bad luck all at once, and their girl showed up at school with that flat, far-off look Della knew from the inside, Della found her at recess and put a fold of paper seed in her hand and told her where the sun came up and what kind of ground these liked, and didn't explain any more than that, because some things you have to plant yourself to understand. Years later, when people asked Della Brandt how a 10-year-old had known to plant sunflowers in the middle of corn country the one summer it would matter, she always told them the truth, which was that she hadn't known anything. Her mother had known. Her mother had carried it down from the North Dakota fields of her girlhood, and tried for years to say it out loud, and when she ran out of years, she'd folded it down into a rusted tin and 6 words and trusted a grieving child to carry it the rest of the way. All Della had done was believe her when no one else would. That, it turned out, was the whole thing. That was everything. On a morning the next August, Della walked down to the South 5 before the bus, the same as she had every morning for a year and more. The field stood 7 feet tall and gold to the creek, every head turned east into the first light, the bees already loud in the rows. Her father came down the slope behind her with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he handed to her now because she was old enough, and Barley came stiff-legged and gray behind him and flopped down in the warm sand to watch the both of them, the way he always had. They stood there together and looked at it, the ground nobody had wanted, The crop a whole county had laughed at, the last green and gold thing in the worst year anyone could remember, planted by a little girl who'd been told to plant it where the corn won't grow. The corn was gone, but the field her mother planted was still standing, and so were they.